When most people hear the word Dunkirk, they picture British soldiers, endless lines on the sand, Spitfires screaming overhead, and a fleet of little boats racing through smoke and shellfire to save them. But behind that story of escape lies another, quieter, darker, and almost forgotten. As British soldiers fled across the Channel, nearly 40,000 French troops remained behind, still fighting in the ruins of Dunkirk. They didn't make it to the boats. They weren't supposed to. Their orders were simple: hold the line until the last ship sails. And when the last ship left, they were still standing there, surrounded, outnumbered, and abandoned. This is their story. The story of France's lost army, the men who fought to the last hour of the Battle of Dunkirk, knowing rescue would never come. By May 1940, France's armies had been shattered. The German blitzkrieg, fast, armored, merciless, tore through the Ardennes and rolled across the plains faster than any defense could react. In just 2 weeks, the supposedly impregnable French lines had crumbled. Belgium was gone. The Netherlands had fallen. And the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, found itself trapped against the sea at Dunkirk. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt called it a pocket waiting to die. Winston Churchill called it a colossal military disaster. And for the French generals, it was something worse, a humiliation on a scale the nation had not known since 1870. But among that chaos, there were still French soldiers who refused to surrender. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for dignity, for the idea that France would not go quietly. By late May, the evacuation had begun, Operation Dynamo. British and French troops were being ferried out from Dunkirk harbor and from the beaches beyond. The operation depended on one thing: time. Every hour that the perimeter around Dunkirk held was another hour for ships to land, load, and sail. And it was the French who gave them that time. Under the command of General Fagalde and General Molinel, several French divisions, including the 12th Motorized Infantry and the 32nd Infantry Division, were ordered to dig in along the canal lines south and west of the city. Their mission: to fight to the last man, to delay the German advance long enough for the evacuation to finish. They fought in farmhouses, factories, even the wreckage of old trams. Machine guns were set up in bedrooms. Snipers fired from church towers. Every street became a barricade. Every bridge a trap. And when German tanks rolled in, they kept fighting with rifles, grenades, even bayonets. By May 30, the beaches were a vision of hell. Smoke from burning oil tanks covered the horizon. German artillery pounded the sands, killing men by the hundreds as they waited for rescue. The Royal Navy's little ships, fishing boats, ferries, tugs came by the hundreds. They carried over 338,000 soldiers back to England. But by June 1, most of the British troops were gone. The French were still there. General Fagalde radioed London, asking for confirmation that his troops would be evacuated next. The response was grim: "We will try." They never did. When the final phase of the evacuation began on June 2, the British lifted off their remaining units and began withdrawing their naval cover. The French rearguard still held the perimeter, unaware that the ships they were protecting had already left. By the morning of June 4, the beaches were empty, except for them. At dawn, German tanks from the 8th Panzer Division stormed into the ruins of Dunkirk. They expected surrender. What they got instead was defiance. In the rubble of the city, the 2nd Light Mechanized Division fought block by block. At the Dunkirk dockyards, Colonel Charles Pichon ordered his men to fight as long as there is a bullet left in France. Some French units fought on even after their ammunition was gone, using bayonets and shovels. Others, cut off and surrounded, refused to hoist white flags. At Fort des Dunes, a coastal fortress east of the city, nearly 400 men of the 12th Infantry Regiment made their last stand. When the Germans demanded surrender, their commander replied, "France has not yet spoken her last word." They were annihilated within hours. By noon, the last French strongpoints were overrun. Nearly 40,000 French soldiers were captured, the final defenders of Dunkirk. Many had fought until their rifles melted from the heat. Those who survived were marched away as prisoners of war. The Germans treated them not as heroes, but as fools. They fought for a lost cause, one officer sneered. But the prisoners knew better. They had bought the escape of the entire British Expeditionary Force. Without their sacrifice, the war might have ended in 1940, with Hitler triumphant over all of Europe. Instead, thanks to their stand, Britain survived to fight on. The irony was brutal. They saved an ally that would soon abandon them. When the British arrived home, the newspapers called Dunkirk a miracle. Churchill's speech thundered through Parliament. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." But he said nothing of the French who died on those same beaches. France, broken and occupied, had no voice left to defend them. For decades, their story remained buried, lost beneath the triumph of the evacuation. Even French schoolbooks spoke of Dunkirk as a British victory. It wasn't until years later that historians uncovered the full truth, that Dunkirk was not just a rescue, it was a sacrifice. And the men who paid that price wore French uniforms. In 1960, veterans of the 12th Motorized Infantry Division gathered at Dunkirk for a quiet ceremony. They were old now, gray-haired, limping, but they stood once again on the sands where they had fought. A British veteran named William Carter attended and told a reporter, "If not for these Frenchmen, I wouldn't be alive to stand here." It took decades for France itself to honor them properly. Monuments were raised small, almost humble, along the dunes and canals they had defended. Each bears the same inscription: "To the soldiers who stood so that others might sail." Even now, at low tide, the beach at Dunkirk reveals the skeletons of burned trucks, sunken landing craft, and twisted rifles half buried in sand. Every year, the sea uncovers new bones, silent witnesses to the battle. Local fishermen sometimes pull up rusted dog tags stamped with French names that history almost forgot. And at night, when the wind blows in from the channel, locals say you can still hear the echo of artillery in the dunes, the sound of a lost army that refused to surrender, even as the rest of the world sailed away. Churchill was right. Dunkirk was a miracle. But miracles are made blood and time. The British miracle was built on French sacrifice. While the world remembers the little ships, France remembers the men who never boarded them. They fought not for victory, but for honor. And though history tried to forget them, the sands of Dunkirk still whisper their names, echoes of courage, ghosts of loyalty, France's lost army. In early May 1940, France was confident, too confident. For 2 decades after World War I, French generals believed the next war would look like the last. They built fortresses, not mobility. They expected another trench war, another Verdun. The Maginot Line, stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg, was a masterpiece of concrete and arrogance. It bristled with guns, bunkers, and underground railways, but it ended at the Belgian border, where the terrain was impassable to tanks. Or so they thought. The Germans proved them wrong in a single week. On the 10th of May 1940, Hitler unleashed his invasion of the West. 3 million men, 2,500 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft moved with mathematical precision. The German plan, Fall Gelb Case Yellow, sent feints into Belgium, drawing Allied forces northward, while the real blow came through the Ardennes forest. The French High Command dismissed the Ardennes as unsuitable for armor. Within days, German panzer divisions were roaring through it, crushing French reconnaissance units that barely had time to radio warnings. By May 13, they had reached the Meuse River. By May 15, they had crossed it. By May 17, they were racing for the sea. The French front had not simply collapsed, it had evaporated. Across Belgium and northern France, roads choked with refugees, mothers pushing carts, farmers leading cows, soldiers walking in stunned silence. German aircraft strafed the columns mercilessly. In the chaos, French and British units became entangled. At one crossroads near Arras, a British officer wrote, "The roads were alive with confusion. Horses, lorries, civilians, everything moving but nothing advancing." The French army was still fighting, but it was fighting blind. Communication lines were destroyed, command posts overrun, orders arrived too late or contradicted one another. In the words of General Georges Blanchard, "We were trying to fight a lightning war with a candle." The decisive moment came at Sedan, where German armor broke through the French 55th Infantry Division's defenses. The division was poorly equipped and exhausted, manning 80 kilometers of front with outdated rifles and no anti-tank support. On May 14, German Stuka dive bombers, over 300 of them, pounded the French lines for 9 continuous hours. It was one of the most intense aerial bombardments in history. When the bombing ended, the French trenches were silent. German troops crossed the river unopposed, and France's back broke in that instant. A single French private later told his interrogators, "The earth itself seemed to explode. We were no longer soldiers, we were dust." At headquarters in Vincennes, French generals argued instead of acting. General Gamelin, the commander-in-chief, refused to believe the reports. He had no radios powerful enough to reach his frontline units, and no mobile reserves to counter the breakthrough. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud begged the British to launch a counterattack. The BEF's commander, Lord Gort, declined. He had orders from London: preserve the British army. Gort's refusal doomed any chance of stabilizing the front. By the time a joint counterattack was attempted near Arras on May 21, the German spearheads were already miles ahead. The counterattack, led by British Matilda tanks and supported by French infantry, briefly stunned the Germans, but lacked coordination and scale. Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, narrowly avoided disaster by using every available gun to halt the British advance. The French saw courage that day, but no salvation. By nightfall, the counterattack was over, and the road to the sea lay open. As the German tide swept toward Dunkirk, political panic set in. Reynaud begged Churchill to commit more ships for evacuation. Churchill hesitated. Britain still hoped France could rally further south. French commanders demanded that the BEF stay and fight beside them. But London's priority was clear: save the army, not the battlefield. On May 25, Churchill made the agonizing decision to begin Operation Dynamo. It was not a joint evacuation, it was a British one, with limited space for their French allies. To preserve unity, both governments agreed to a lie: that French and British troops would be evacuated together. In reality, British soldiers boarded first. By May 28, French commanders at Dunkirk realized what was happening. The BEF was pulling back to the beaches, leaving French divisions still fighting the encirclement. General Blanchard protested, accusing the British of abandoning their post. Churchill insisted otherwise, but privately admitted to his cabinet that the French are sacrificed. The French officers on the ground felt it as a wound to their honor. At a staff meeting, General Molyneux reportedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "We are not retreating to the boats. We are the boats." The men around him nodded grimly. They knew what that meant. They would fight until they couldn't. While soldiers fought, millions of civilians fled. The highways of France became rivers of despair, stretching from Flanders to the Loire. Elderly men pushed wheelbarrows. Children clung to livestock. Entire villages moved together, carrying their church bells and flags. It was the largest migration in Western Europe since the Middle Ages. German planes bombed them without mercy, turning roads into infernos. The French word exode, exodus, entered the national vocabulary that summer. A British war correspondent wrote, "We passed a line of refugees that never seemed to end. There were no faces left, only dust and silence." Amid that chaos, French soldiers often refused evacuation so that civilians could escape first. In one incident at Gravelines, troops of the 68th Division used their last ammunition to hold a bridge for a column of villagers. When the Germans arrived, every Frenchman there was dead. By May 30, northern France was burning. The Germans had encircled Calais, captured Boulogne, and were shelling Dunkirk. The French government had fled Paris. At Dunkirk, 200,000 British and 100,000 French troops crowded the beaches. The air reeked of oil, cordite, and death. German dive bombers screamed down like iron vultures. Yet, the evacuation continued, hour by hour. Each night, the sea turned black, with ships, destroyers, minesweepers, fishing trawlers, even yachts. But as British numbers dwindled, French troops were ordered to form a final line of defense. They knew what that meant. They would not be coming home. When General Molinel received confirmation that the British were leaving, he radioed headquarters with a simple message: "We will hold as long as France exists." They did. For 5 days, from May 30 to June 4, the French rear guard fought like men outside of time. At Bergues, the 2nd Light Division held off tanks with anti-aircraft guns. At Furnace, a handful of artillery crews fired until their pieces were red hot. At Dunkirk itself, the 12th Motorized Division fought from cellar to cellar, even as the harbor burned. When the last British ship sailed, they stayed behind, exhausted, out of ammunition, surrounded. For many, the final order they heard was a single word: tenir, hold. They held until death or capture, and in that act, France found its first moment of redemption. When news of Dunkirk reached southern France, it was celebrated in Britain, but mourned in Paris. Marshal Pétain, soon to lead the Vichy regime, used it as proof that France has been betrayed. He accused Britain of saving itself and leaving France to perish. But Charles de Gaulle, newly appointed Under-Secretary of War, saw it differently. He said, "The soul of France has not surrendered at Dunkirk. It has only begun to fight elsewhere." De Gaulle's vision would become the heart of the Free French movement, born from the ashes of Dunkirk and the fury of betrayal. In the years that followed, British films turned Dunkirk into legend. But for France, it remained a scar. The soldiers who stayed were remembered less as heroes than as ghosts, men who fought bravely but died in silence. Only in recent decades has France reclaimed their story. At Dunkirk's memorial, one inscription finally speaks for them. Here stood the forgotten army of France, whose courage gave the world one more day to live free. That one day became the foundation of Allied victory. The men who stayed behind bought it with their lives. The night sky above Dunkirk was orange with fire. Oil tanks burned like volcanoes, and the sea itself seemed to glow. Artillery shells fell with the rhythm of a storm, and the wind carried a strange sound, not quite thunder, not quite waves, the sound of warships approaching. It was the 27th of May, 1940. For thousands of French soldiers pinned between the advancing Germans and the sea, those engines meant one thing: salvation. Operation Dynamo had begun. The world would remember it as a miracle. But for the French, it began as confusion and ended as tragedy. The beaches stretched for miles, flat, featureless, and deadly. Hundreds of thousands of men gathered there, waiting for ships that couldn't reach them. The sea was too shallow for large vessels, so destroyers and troop ships anchored offshore while smaller boats shuttled men to them. But there was no order, no system. French and British troops mixed chaotically, exhausted, hungry, covered in mud. Lines of soldiers stretched into the surf, knee-deep, waist-deep, chest-deep, clutching rifles and prayers. Above them, German bombers circled like hawks. Each explosion threw sand and bodies into the air. When the tide came in, it washed away the dead. A French lieutenant wrote in his diary that night, "We are no longer soldiers. We are shadows on fire." At first, the cooperation was friendly comrades in retreat. But as evacuation priorities became clear, tension grew. British troops were loaded first. Their ships, their command, their plan. French soldiers began to ask questions. Why were they holding the perimeter while the British withdrew? Why were they promised evacuation but kept waiting as the beaches emptied? Rumors spread that the British would abandon them entirely. At one jetty, a French captain confronted a British officer who was restricting access to his ship. Witnesses recorded his furious words. "Is France not your ally? Do you think your empire will stand alone?" The officer didn't answer. The engines roared, and the ship pulled away, leaving hundreds of Frenchmen waist-deep in the water. Every type of vessel that could float was pressed into service. Coastal ferries, lifeboats, tugs, fishing boats, barges, even pleasure yachts. To the French trapped onshore, it looked less like a navy and more like a miracle made of wood and smoke. One of those boats, the Sundowner, a civilian yacht from Kent, carried 130 men in a single trip, half of them French. Its captain, Charles Lightoller, the former second officer of the Titanic, shouted over the noise, "Come on, lads! There's room for France yet!" Some boats made it back and forth a dozen times. Others were sunk after their first run. The sea around Dunkirk became a graveyard of wrecks, masts poking from the surf like tombstones. But every trip bought time. Every soldier rescued meant one more chance for the war to continue. While tens of thousands boarded, tens of thousands more simply waited trapped behind the dunes or guarding the perimeter. For many French units, their orders were not to evacuate yet. They were to hold the line until the last British ship sailed. In the villages of Bray Dunes and Malo-les-Bains, entire companies dug trenches facing south toward the oncoming Germans. They could see the ships leaving offshore, and still, they stayed. A sergeant of the 32nd Infantry Division wrote later, "We saw them go one by one. We cheered them, even as we knew we would never follow." He died 2 days later in an artillery barrage. The air war over Dunkirk was one of the fiercest of the campaign. German dive bombers, the feared Stukas, targeted ships and beaches without pause. British Spitfires and Hurricanes from the RAF fought desperately to cover the evacuation. But many of those French on the ground didn't realize the RAF was there. The dogfights happened miles above the smoke, invisible through the haze. To the soldiers on the sand, it seemed the sky had abandoned them. When bombs struck the piers, men were hurled into the water, drowning under their own gear. Ships sank within minutes, destroyers like the Wakeful, the Grenade, the Basilisk. Survivors clung to floating debris as oil fires spread across the waves. One French corporal later recalled, "The sea was burning. We swam through flame, not water." While the British Navy directed the evacuation, the Marine Nationale, what was left of it, fought to protect it. French destroyers like Le Foudroyant and Chacal provided gunfire support until they were destroyed by German air attacks. Le Foudroyant sank while covering the retreat of British troops. Her last shells fired blind through the smoke. Only a handful of sailors survived. The French Navy lost over 20 ships in the evacuation, most of them staying behind to draw fire away from British transports. Their sacrifice rarely makes the headlines in history books, but without them, many of the little ships would never have reached the beach. By June 1, the evacuation was nearing its end. The harbor was gone, the beaches cratered. Still, French troops held the perimeter, the last wall between the Germans and the sea. That night, the final British destroyers began loading the remaining French divisions. Shells fell without pause. A single German bomb could kill hundreds in line. On the pier known as the East Mole, officers shouted names in the dark. Thousands pressed forward in silence, praying to hear theirs. Some broke ranks, begging to board. Others stood back, accepting their fate. A British sailor later wrote, "I saw men waiting who knew they wouldn't make it. They stood to attention, rifles at their sides, and watched us leave. It was the bravest sight I ever saw." At 3, on June 2, the last evacuation signal was sent. Operation Dynamo was over. By then, 338,000 soldiers had been rescued, of which roughly 123,000 were French. Tens of thousands more were left behind to face capture. On June 4, the German flag rose over Dunkirk. The beaches were silent now, littered with helmets, wrecks, and the smell of fuel. In the distance, the channel shimmered, that narrow strip of water that had separated salvation from defeat. For the French soldiers who never crossed it, the war was not over. It was only beginning in captivity, in exile, or in the resistance. In the following days, the Germans marched their prisoners away by the thousands. Columns of men stretched for miles, French, Belgian, and the few British stragglers left behind. They sang the Marseillaise as they passed through Dunkirk's ruins. Even German soldiers paused to watch them go. Many would spend the next 5 years in prison camps across Germany and Poland. Others would escape and join Free France under Charles de Gaulle, but most would simply vanish from the records, the forgotten defenders of the miracle of Dunkirk. When Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons on the 4th of June, 1940, the world cheered his defiance. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." But he also added a quieter line, almost buried at the end. "The French army fought magnificently. They have suffered greatly. They have been our comrades." Few remembered that line. But for the men left behind on the beaches, it was all they ever received, a single sentence of thanks from across the sea. History calls it the miracle of Dunkirk. But miracles demand sacrifices, and the French paid most of the cost. They fought until the ammunition ran dry, until their bayonets broke, until their country itself collapsed around them. And still, they fought. The British escaped. The world survived. And France, though defeated, found in those burning sands the first flicker of the courage that would one day return to liberate her. When the guns finally fell silent over Dunkirk, the beaches were filled with the living ghosts of an army. Tens of thousands of French soldiers, exhausted, hungry, and numb, stood surrounded by German troops. They had fought until the last shell, obeyed every order, and waited for ships that never came. Now they were prisoners. The Germans marched them east, in endless columns that stretched across northern France. Civilians lined the roads in silence, some offering bread, others staring in disbelief. One old woman whispered to her daughter, "They look like our own sons, only older." The prisoners trudged on for days, sleeping in fields, drinking from ditches, their boots falling apart. Some collapsed and were left behind. Others were shot for trying to escape. By mid-June, they had reached Germany. Their destination, Stalags prisoner of war camps that would hold them for years. The camps were crude at first, barbed wire enclosures, wooden barracks, watchtowers with machine guns. Each man was registered, photographed, and branded with a number. They were no longer soldiers of France. They were Gefangene, prisoners. Inside Stalag 8B, near Lambsdorff in Silesia, thousands of Frenchmen slept on straw under leaking roofs. They were fed black bread, watery soup, and ersatz coffee. Letters from home took months to arrive, if they came at all. The Red Cross delivered parcels, but not dignity. The guards treated them as relics of a defeated world, men whose nation no longer existed. One prisoner, Corporal Henri Baudry, wrote in secret, "We built fences within the fences, one for our bodies, one for our hopes." Time in the camps moved slowly, measured by hunger and rumor. The men organized themselves into little societies. Some taught classes, others staged plays or carved trinkets from scrap wood. The will to survive became an act of rebellion. At Christmas 1940, in Stalag XXA, a French sergeant painted a tiny tricolor flag on a bit of tin from a sardine can. He hid it in the barracks wall, whispering, "France still lives here." The Germans tried to break morale through propaganda pamphlets, claiming that Marshal Pétain's Vichy government was negotiating their release. Some believed it, most did not, because they knew that in the eyes of the new regime, they were not heroes, they were inconveniences. While French soldiers languished in German camps, the Vichy government in the unoccupied South signed agreements to cooperate with Hitler. Marshal Pétain called the prisoners sons who must accept their fate. He issued speeches urging them to remain docile and patient. He promised repatriation for those willing to work for Germany. Tens of thousands accepted, sent to farms and factories across the Reich under the so-called Relève labor program. They were told their labor would help bring other prisoners home. In truth, few ever returned. They became hostages to both sides, useful to Germany, forgotten by France. But not all obeyed. From the first months of captivity, escape attempts multiplied. Prisoners dug tunnels under fences, hid in supply trucks, or simply walked out during confusion and air raids. One of the most daring escapes came from Stalag IB near Hohenstein. In March 1942, 4 French officers disguised themselves as German railway workers, stole a locomotive, and drove it across Poland before abandoning it in a forest. 2 were recaptured, but the others reached Yugoslavia and joined local partisans. Others escaped back into occupied France, where they joined the resistance. Their experience in the army made them invaluable, disciplined, trained, and hardened by years of humiliation. One escapee, Lieutenant Pierre Le Goff, became a legend under the code name Michel des Sables. He had fought at Dunkirk, been captured, escaped twice, and led sabotage missions against German rail lines in 1943. When asked why he kept fighting, he said simply, "Because I wasn't finished at Dunkirk." By 1943, the balance of power in Europe began to shift. Allied victories in North Africa and Italy rekindled hope among the prisoners. They formed secret news networks using stolen radios and coded letters. When news arrived of de Gaulle's Free French forces landing in Corsica, cheers erupted behind the barbed wire. Guards punished them with isolation, but morale had already changed. The prisoners began calling themselves les oubliés vivants, the living forgotten. They painted the Cross of Lorraine, the symbol of free France, on scraps of cardboard and sang the Marseillaise at night, defying orders. The camps became schools of patience and endurance. Men who had once fought on the beaches now fought the slow war of survival. Back home, millions of French families lived between silence and despair. Letters from the front stopped coming. Wives received only official postcards marked en captivité en Allemagne. In small towns, women gathered to share fragments of news: who had written, who hadn't, who was rumored to be alive. They learned to live without husbands, brothers, and sons, holding France together while its men disappeared behind enemy lines. A woman from Lille told an interviewer years later, "We were told they were safe, but no one survives 5 winters behind barbed wire without dying inside." The endurance of these women became an unspoken front of its own, a war of waiting. When Allied forces finally reached Germany in spring 1945, they found the camps in ruins. Emaciated men stumbled out of the gates, some too weak to speak. The tricolor flags they had hidden were raised once more, trembling in the cold wind. French soldiers greeted their liberators with tears, cheers, and disbelief. One British officer described the moment. "They saluted, as if they still stood on parade at Dunkirk." They had waited 5 years to finish that salute. By the end of 1945, roughly 1.6 million French prisoners of war had been repatriated. Many came home to a country they no longer recognized. Their wives had aged, their children had grown. Some came home to find their homes occupied, their jobs gone. They were free but forgotten. Post-war France preferred stories of the resistance, not captivity. Prisoners of war didn't fit neatly into the narrative of heroism. They had survived, but they had not fought. In school books and ceremonies, their story was reduced to a few paragraphs. For decades, few medals were awarded, few monuments built. One veteran said bitterly, "In 1962, they remember the ones who died. They forget the ones who waited to die." Yet, historians now recognize their endurance as an essential part of France's wartime experience, proof that resistance can take many forms. To stay alive, to keep one's humanity under captivity, was a quiet defiance of its own. Every year, at Dunkirk Cemetery, small groups of survivors gather, their ranks thin with each passing season. They bring with them medals, old caps, and stories heavy with silence. They speak not of glory, but of ghosts. The comrades who fell on the sand, the ones who vanished in camps, the voices still trapped behind fences. And when they look at the sea, they don't see escape or miracle. They see the faces of the men who didn't leave. One veteran put it best: "For the world, Dunkirk was deliverance. For us, it was exile." The soldiers of Dunkirk paid twice, once in blood, once in memory. They fought for an army that ceased to exist and returned to a nation that no longer remembered. But without them, there would have been no Britain to continue the war, no D-Day, no liberation. They were the wall that held long enough for the world to breathe again. In that sense, they did not lose. They endured. And in endurance, there is a different kind of victory. Because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not to die for his country, but to live long enough to remember it. When the war finally ended, France celebrated in the streets, Paris liberated, tricolor flags waving, the sound of bells and victory parades. But for the men of Dunkirk, the survivors of 1940, there were no parades waiting for them. They stepped off trains wearing the same uniforms they had worn 5 years earlier, faded and patched with wire scars from the camps. They were thin, quiet, unshaven. They carried their memories like wounds they could not display. As one officer wrote in his journal, "The war ended. Our silence began." The public wanted heroes of the resistance, the fighters, the martyrs, the symbols of defiance. There was little room in that narrative for the defeated, the captured, the forgotten. Post-war France was not only rebuilding its cities, it was rebuilding its story. Charles de Gaulle, now head of the provisional government, understood the power of myth. To restore France's pride, he needed a story of unity and resistance, not of collapse and surrender. He declared that the true France had never ceased to fight, that Vichy had been an illegitimate regime, and that France had liberated itself. It was an act of genius and erasure. The soldiers of Dunkirk, who had fought and fallen in 1940, did not fit this new myth. Their defeat contradicted the idea of an unbroken France, so their story faded first from speeches, then from textbooks, then from memory. A veteran later said, "We were ghosts twice, once on the beaches, once in the history books." De Gaulle's narrative was not cruelty, it was necessity. In 1945, France was shattered politically, economically, and morally. To survive, it needed faith in itself. The image of an unbroken line of resistance from London to Paris gave the country pride and legitimacy on the world stage. It helped secure France's seat among the victors and erase the shame of Vichy. But that same myth also buried the memory of the men who had stood at Dunkirk, who had delayed defeat so that Britain could escape and the future could exist at all. History replaced them with the image of Free France's rebirth, heroic, defiant, and pure. The ghosts of Dunkirk were too gray for that story. For decades, the story of Dunkirk in France remained muted. Schoolchildren learned the word débâcle, collapse, to describe 1940. The focus was on failure, not courage. Teachers spoke of the miracle of the British evacuation, but rarely of the French sacrifice. In cinema, the silence was even louder. British directors like David Lean and later Christopher Nolan would turn Dunkirk into legend, but always through English eyes. French soldiers were background figures, anonymous, silent, doomed. It wasn't until the 1960 seconds that French filmmakers began to re-examine those early days of the war, asking, who really stood and fought when France fell? The answers were uncomfortable and heroic. By the Partick, 1970 seconds. The first serious works of French historians began to challenge the narrative. Men like Jean-Paul Cointet, Marc Bloch, and later Jean-Louis Crémieux-Brilhac dug through archives and diaries long ignored. They found reports from Dunkirk's final defenders, handwritten logs, casualty lists, and after-action reports never published. The records revealed that over 30,000 French soldiers had fought until the last day, and that without their stand, Operation Dynamo would have failed. One document from the 12th Motorized Infantry Division listed its losses: 87% of its officers killed, wounded, or captured, 72% of its men missing in action. 0 units surrendered before running out of ammunition. These were not statistics of a defeated army. They were statistics of sacrifice. The more historians uncovered, the more the official narrative strained under its weight. The idea of a cowardly France collapsing overnight no longer held. Yes, the government had fallen, but the soldiers had fought. Public sentiment began to shift. Television documentaries aired interviews with surviving Dunkirk veterans, men who had been silent for 40 years. Their voices were calm, without bitterness, but heavy with memory. One said quietly, "When the British left, we waved. When the Germans came, we stood. That is all." Audiences listened and realized, for the first time, that heroism had existed even in defeat. By the 1980 seconds, France was entering what historians called the era of remembrance. The country began confronting its past more honestly, from Vichy collaboration to colonial wars. In that climate, Dunkirk's forgotten soldiers finally began to return to public consciousness. In 1985, President François Mitterrand attended a memorial service at Dunkirk. Standing before rows of tricolor flags and weathered veterans, he said, "These men did not flee, they held. Because they held, others could live." It was the first time a French head of state publicly acknowledged their role in the miracle of Dunkirk. That speech marked the beginning of their slow resurrection from obscurity. For the veterans themselves, recognition came too late. Most had spent their lives as quiet men, railway workers, farmers, factory hands. They rarely spoke of the war, even to their families. Their children often discovered the truth only after their fathers' deaths, in boxes of medals, faded photographs, or notebooks filled with sand-grained pages. One such journal, found in 1,999 inches an attic near Rouen, ended with the words, "If France lives, it is because someone stayed behind." Those words now appear engraved on a monument overlooking the Dunkirk dunes. In 2005, veterans from both nations gathered for the 65th anniversary of Dunkirk. British survivors arrived in wheelchairs, draped in Union Jacks. French veterans wore berets and medals, long unworn. When they met, there was no bitterness, only tears. A British sailor told reporters, "We left them, and still they fought. They were the bravest of us all." The crowd applauded, and for the first time in 65 years, both nations stood together to honor the full truth, that the miracle of Dunkirk was a shared miracle, built on shared blood. Modern filmmakers have begun to restore the missing half of Dunkirk's story. In 2017, Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk included French soldiers guarding the mole, dying namelessly but heroically. Audiences noticed and asked who they were. That question reignited public interest in France. Historians released new books, museums expanded exhibits, and documentaries finally gave names and faces to those soldiers. One museum curator in Dunkirk said, "For decades, people asked where the French were. Now they are here in every photograph, every uniform, every silence." The ghosts were finally visible. Today, Dunkirk is no longer just a story of escape. It is a story of endurance, French as much as British. Every May, ceremonies along the dunes bring together school children, soldiers, and survivors. French students now learn that Dunkirk was not merely an evacuation, but a stand. They are told that when Britain escaped, France ensured that it could. At the Dunkirk War Memorial, the inscription carved in both French and English reads, "To those who fought when hope had already departed, the ghosts of Dunkirk have finally come home, not to parades, but to memory." Their story has become part of France's long reconciliation with its past, a reminder that even in defeat, courage has meaning. De Gaulle gave France back her pride through myth, but the men of Dunkirk gave her something even greater truth. They proved that heroism is not the privilege of the victorious, that sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones the world never sees. And when the tide rolls over Dunkirk's sands today, it does not wash away their footprints, it reveals them. At low tide, the sands of Dunkirk stretch endlessly pale, rippled, and silent. Tourists stroll where once entire armies stood shoulder to shoulder. Children build sandcastles where machine guns once roared. The gulls cry over a sea that remembers everything. Every grain of sand here has felt fire. Every gust of wind carries a whisper, the echo of orders shouted in panic, of prayers muttered in French and English, of boots trudging into water they believed would save them. 85 years have passed, but the tide still brings back memories the world thought it had buried. When the guns fell silent in 1940, Dunkirk was synonymous with disaster. For France, it symbolized humiliation. For Britain, it became the miracle that saved an empire. But over time, that narrative changed. Historians began to see Dunkirk not as a defeat, but as a transformation, the moment when survival itself became a form of victory. And nowhere was that transformation more profound than in France. The men who stayed behind had not lost. They had made loss itself meaningful. Their sacrifice gave defeat a dignity that France would later build upon when she rose again in 1944. It was from the ashes of Dunkirk's surrender that de Gaulle's call to arms in London would echo. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. That line, born of defiance, was only possible because some French soldiers had proven it true. For decades, Britain and France remembered Dunkirk differently. In Britain, it was triumph against all odds, the Dunkirk spirit. In France, it was tragedy, the Dunkirk wound. But as archives opened and historians on both sides began to share documents, a deeper understanding emerged. That neither version was complete without the other. The British remembered the boats that left. The French remembered the men who stayed. Together, those two memories formed the full truth, a bridge between nations, once divided by fear and circumstance. Every joint commemoration now includes both flags. Every wreath laid bears both languages. The story that once separated Britain and France has become the story that binds them. Dunkirk's story has returned not only through history books, but through art paintings, novels, films, even music. French composer Pascal Dussapin once described Dunkirk as a silence so loud that even music struggles to approach it. Artists have painted its beaches, not in black and white, but in the gray tones of moral complexity, where bravery coexists with despair and sacrifice walks hand in hand with futility. Each new generation rediscovers Dunkirk differently. For the survivors of 1940, it was a wound. For their children, it was a lesson. For today's youth, it is a question. What would we have done? The French military today still teaches Dunkirk not as a battle lost, but as an example of what endurance means. Officers at the École de Guerre study the evacuation as a case of leadership under collapse. They learn that even when everything breaks, duty does not. The motto on the walls of Dunkirk's Memorial Museum reads, Tenir même quand tout s'effondre. Hold even when all collapses. It's a lesson that transcends armies and generations, that courage is not always measured in victories, but in what one refuses to abandon. Each year, on May 26, at dawn, French veterans, British officers, and local citizens gather on the shore. Bugles play. The tide creeps forward, touching the boots of soldiers in ceremonial ranks. Children release paper boats into the surf, red, white, and blue, carrying handwritten names: Jean, André, Thomas, William, Pierre, Jack. The sea carries them away, just as it once carried their grandfathers. When the waves roll back, the sand is clean again, but the names linger in the minds of those who watched them drift. Dunkirk has outgrown its geography. It is no longer just a French or British story. It is a universal parable about the thin line between disaster and deliverance. Every nation facing collapse finds something of itself in Dunkirk, the struggle to preserve humanity when the world falls apart. In military academies, from West Point to Saint-Cyr, instructors now refer to the Dunkirk principle: when surrounded, survival can be the ultimate act of resistance. Because in that survival lies the seed of everything that comes after resistance, recovery, redemption. Today, the memorial at Dunkirk stands where the sea meets the dunes. Etched in stone are the words, "They held so that others might live." Every year, fewer veterans return, but the faces that replace them, their grandchildren, students, tourists, carry the same reverence. On quiet days, visitors place small stones on the plaques, a Jewish tradition for honoring the dead that has become universal here. The stones form little cairns of gratitude. each one saying, "We remember you." And in that gesture lies France's redemption, not in denial, not in pride, but in remembrance. As the last witnesses fade, technology now preserves what time would erase. Dunkirk's museum uses holographic survivors to tell their stories. Real words, real voices, recorded decades ago, projected in light. A child can walk up, ask, "What did you see?" And the ghost of a soldier answers, softly, "I saw France stand." Artificial intelligence recreates their faces from grainy photos. Digital maps let visitors walk through the battle in augmented reality, following the lines of retreat and defense, seeing the beaches as they were in 1940. It's history reimagined not as distance, but as presence. Dunkirk is no longer a memory fading in books. It's an experience, living in light. Beyond the strategy and the symbolism lies something simpler. Dunkirk was a moment when ordinary men discovered the extraordinary within themselves. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because there was no one else left to fight. One French corporal wrote in his last letter before capture, "We are not heroes. We are just men who refused to leave our posts." That sentence captures the soul of Dunkirk, the quiet, stubborn, heartbreaking dignity of duty. At night, when the tide rises and the wind blows inland, the dunes whisper. Locals say you can sometimes hear footsteps in the surf, not waves, but boots marching in rhythm with the sea. They say the ghosts of Dunkirk return each year to watch over the living, to make sure the world still remembers what it cost to keep its freedom afloat. No one knows if that's true. But every May, as the sun rises over the channel, the light falls across the old fort walls and the memorial stones, and for a moment, the beach seems alive again, with soldiers, with courage, with France, because history does not die. It waits like the tide to return. The men of Dunkirk were never meant to be legends. They were meant to be lost. But history has a way of finding its own heroes, and the sands of Dunkirk have whispered their names long enough for the world to finally listen. Defeat became endurance. Endurance became honor. And honor became immortality.